The auction hall buzzed with the excited chatter of alien collectors from across the galaxy. Towering Zephyrians with their crystalline exoskeletons clicked their mandibles in amusement, while sleek Vortani delegates whispered among themselves in their melodic tongue. The air shimmered with translation fields as dozens of species gathered for what promised to be the most entertaining auction of the cycle. At the center of the grand hall, displayed on a simple metal podium, sat what appeared to be nothing more than an ancient human rifle. The weapon looked pathetic compared to the gleaming plasma cannons and quantum disruptors that filled the rest of the auction house. Its metal surface showed patches of rust, and the wooden stock bore scratches and wear marks from countless battles fought long ago. Ambassador Korith of the Zephyrian Empire examined the weapon through his compound eyes, his translator crackling to life. This is what the humans called their most feared weapon? It looks like something a primitive hunter might use to kill small animals. The auctioneer, a portly Glixian with 4 arms and a nervous disposition, cleared his throat loudly. Ladies, gentlemen, and esteemed beings of all classifications, we present item 247 from the recently discovered human military cache on the dead world of Terra Prime. According to the archaeological reports, this weapon was carried by one Marcus Chen, a human soldier who served during what they called the War of Independence some 300 years ago. A ripple of laughter swept through the crowd. The humans had been extinct for over a century. Their homeworld reduced to radioactive ash after their final desperate stand against the Galactic Coalition. Most species regarded them as nothing more than an interesting footnote in galactic history, remembered mainly for their stubborn refusal to surrender even when facing impossible odds. The weapon uses what humans called kinetic projectiles, the auctioneer continued, consulting his datapad. Primitive metal bullets propelled by chemical explosives. Our weapons experts estimate it could penetrate perhaps 2 centimeters of standard hull plating, assuming optimal conditions. This drew even more laughter from the audience. Modern personal shields could deflect plasma bolts that could melt through a meter of reinforced titanium. The idea that anyone would fear such a primitive device seemed absurd. Captain Thrix of the Hegemony Navy leaned back in his hover seat, his reptilian features twisted in amusement. I heard humans were supposed to be dangerous warriors. This relic makes them look like children playing with toys. The starting bid is 50 credits, announced the auctioneer, his voice betraying his own skepticism about whether anyone would even bother to bid. Several hands shot up immediately, though clearly not from serious collectors. A young Andromedan noble raised his paddle with a smirk. 50 credits for a conversation piece, he called out, eliciting chuckles from his companions. 75, countered a Vortani art dealer, her silver skin gleaming under the auction hall lights. My clients enjoy collecting primitive weapons from extinct species. The bidding continued in this casual manner, with various buyers treating the human weapon as nothing more than an amusing curiosity. The price climbed slowly to 300 credits, still far below what any functional weapon would command. In the back of the hall, unnoticed by most of the crowd, an elderly figure watched the proceedings with intense interest. Dr. Elena Vasquez was one of the last surviving humans in the galaxy, having escaped the destruction of Earth aboard a medical transport decades earlier. She had spent the intervening years working as a xenobiologist on various frontier worlds, keeping her human heritage carefully hidden. Elena's hands trembled as she watched the aliens mock the weapon that had once belonged to her grandfather's unit. Marcus Chen had been a legend among the human resistance fighters, a man whose name was spoken with reverence by those who remembered the final days of the war. 300 going once, called the auctioneer, his tone suggesting he was eager to move on to more valuable items. A new voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. 5,000 credits. The hall fell silent as all eyes turned toward the source of the bid. Elena stepped forward, her heart pounding as she revealed herself for the first time in decades. She was clearly human, though her appearance had been modified over the years to help her blend in among other humanoid species. 5,000 credits, she repeated, her voice steady, despite the shocked stares of the assembled aliens. Captain Thrix's eyes widened in surprise. By the void, it's actually a human. I thought they were all dead. Not quite, Elena replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. And I know exactly what that weapon is capable of. The Zephyrian ambassador clicked his mandibles dismissively. Surely you don't expect us to believe this primitive device poses any real threat? Our armor can withstand plasma cannons that generate temperatures hotter than a star's core. Elena smiled sadly as she looked at the rifle. You're thinking like modern warriors, accustomed to energy weapons and force fields. You've forgotten the most basic principle of warfare that my people never forgot. And what principle is that? Asked the Vortani art dealer, her tone dripping with condescension. It's not always about having the most advanced weapon, Elena explained, stepping closer to the podium. Sometimes it's about understanding your enemy's weaknesses and exploiting them with surgical precision. The crowd erupted in fresh laughter. The idea that such a primitive weapon could exploit any weakness in their advanced technology seemed ridiculous. Their ships could destroy planets, their personal armor could withstand nuclear explosions, and their weapons could vaporize entire city blocks. 5,000 going once, called the auctioneer, clearly hoping to close the sale before the situation became even more awkward. Elena raised her paddle again. 10,000. The laughter died slightly. 10,000 credits was real money, even by galactic standards. The fact that someone was willing to pay such a sum for what appeared to be a museum piece gave some of the observers pause. Perhaps the human knows something we don't, murmured one of the Andromedan nobles to his companion. Captain Thrix stood up, his massive frame casting a shadow across several rows of seats. I think we've indulged this charade long enough. No human relic is worth 10,000 credits regardless of its sentimental value. He gestured toward his bodyguards, two heavily armed hegemony soldiers who began moving toward Elena. Their armor gleamed with the distinctive blue glow of active energy shields, and plasma rifles hung at their sides. I'm afraid I must question whether this individual has the legal right to participate in this auction, Thrix announced. Humans are considered an extinct species under galactic law. This person's presence here may constitute a form of historical fraud. Elena felt the familiar weight of centuries of prejudice and persecution settling on her shoulders. Even in death, humans were denied the basic dignity of having their history respected. She thought of her grandfather, of Marcus Chen, and of all the brave souls who had fought and died defending humanity's right to exist. The weapon stays with me, she said quietly, but her voice carried clearly through the hushed hall. Whatever the cost. The auctioneer looked nervously between Elena and the approaching guards. Perhaps we should postpone this particular lot until we can verify the bidder's credentials? 20,000 credits, Elena announced, causing gasps throughout the hall. Captain Thrix stopped in his tracks, his reptilian features twisting with confusion. 20,000 credits was more than most people earned in a year. The idea that anyone would pay such a sum for a primitive kinetic weapon defied all logic. This is madness, he declared. What could possibly make that ancient relic worth such a fortune? Elena's eyes met his across the crowded hall, and for the first time since the bidding began, her expression grew truly serious. Because, Captain, you're about to learn why the galaxy's most advanced civilizations took 300 years and the combined might of 50 species to finally defeat a single human world. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder as the implications of her words began to sink in. If humans had truly been as primitive as everyone believed, why had it taken such overwhelming force to defeat them? And why would one of the last surviving members of that extinct species be willing to pay a fortune for what appeared to be nothing more than an antique? 20,000 going once, the auctioneer called, his voice shaking slightly. No one else raised their paddle. The sum was too large for a mere curiosity, but the growing unease in the hall suggested that perhaps this was more than just an expensive piece of nostalgia. Going twice. Elena stepped forward, her hand already reaching for her credit chip. Around her, the assembled aliens watched with a mixture of curiosity and concern. They had come to mock a relic of a dead civilization. But something about the humans' confidence was beginning to worry them. Sold for 20,000 credits to the human bidder. As Elena approached the podium to claim her grandfather's rifle, Captain Thrix made a decision that would change everything. His hand moved to the plasma pistol at his side, its energy cell charging with an ominous whine. "I don't think so," he growled. "That weapon belongs in a museum, not in the hands of someone who might harbor terrorist intentions against the Galactic Order." Elena paused with her hand, just inches from the rifle. Around the hall, other armed guards began moving into position, their weapons drawn and energy shields flaring to life. The situation was escalating rapidly from a simple auction dispute to a potential firefight. "Captain," Elena said softly, not turning around to face him, "I want you to remember something important." "And what's that?" Thrix demanded, his weapon now fully charged and aimed at the back of her head. Elena's fingers closed around the worn wooden stock of her grandfather's rifle, and she felt the familiar weight of the weapon in her hands. It had been cleaned and maintained over the centuries, its mechanism still functional despite its age. "I want you to remember that you're not dealing with a museum piece," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "You're dealing with a weapon that was designed by humans, wielded by humans, and feared by every advanced civilization in the galaxy." She turned slowly to face the captain, the rifle held confidently in her hands. Despite its age and apparent primitiveness, there was something about the way she held it that made several of the aliens step back nervously. "And most importantly," Elena continued, her finger finding the trigger with practiced ease, "you're about to learn why they called my grandfather the Ghost of Terra Prime." The auction hall erupted into chaos as various factions began choosing sides. Some aliens backed away from the confrontation, while others moved closer, eager to see whether the legendary human warrior skills were real or merely exaggerated myths. Captain Thrix tightened his grip on his plasma pistol, the weapon's energy output indicator showing full charge. His armor's defensive systems were active, and he had the backing of a dozen heavily armed guards. Against a single human with an antique rifle, victory seemed assured. But as Elena Chen Vasquez looked down the iron sights of her grandfather's weapon, she felt the presence of every human warrior who had ever carried it into battle. This wasn't just about reclaiming a family heirloom or settling an auction dispute. This was about proving that some things transcend technology, that courage and skill and determination could overcome any advantage. This was about showing the galaxy that humans had never been the primitive species they imagined. The rifle felt alive in her hands, 3 centuries of human craftsmanship and battlefield experience condensed into wood and steel and iron. As the energy weapons of her enemies hummed with lethal power, Elena smiled with quiet confidence. They were about to learn why Earth had never surrendered, and why the human spirit had taken an entire galaxy to destroy. The lesson was about to begin, and the teachers were about to become students. The tension in the auction hall reached a breaking point as Captain Thrix's plasma pistol hummed with deadly energy. Around the room, a dozen hegemony guards had their weapons trained on Elena, their blue-tinged energy shields shimmering like deadly halos. The assembled alien dignitaries pressed back against the walls, eager to witness what they assumed would be a swift execution of the last foolish human. "Drop the primitive weapon, human," Thrix commanded, his reptilian voice dripping with contempt. "You're surrounded by the finest military technology in the galaxy. That ancient relic can't possibly threaten us." Elena adjusted her grip on the rifle, feeling the worn grooves where her grandfather's fingers had rested during countless battles. The weapon felt different in her hands now, as if 3 centuries of dormant power were slowly awakening. She could almost hear Marcus Chen's voice whispering tactical advice across the decades. "You know what your greatest weakness is, Captain?" Elena asked, her voice calm despite the energy weapons pointed at her from every direction. "Enlighten me," Thrix replied sarcastically. "You've grown soft," Elena said, shifting her weight slightly as she evaluated the positions of the guards around her. "Your technology is so advanced, your shield so powerful, your weapons so devastating, that you've forgotten the most basic principles of warfare." One of the Zephyrian observers chittered nervously. "What principles could possibly matter when facing such overwhelming firepower?" Elena smiled grimly. "Movement, positioning, and timing. 3 things that no amount of technology can replace." Before anyone could react, Elena dropped into a combat role that would have made her grandfather proud. The movement was so sudden and fluid that several guards fired reflexively, their plasma bolts searing through empty air where she had been standing just moments before. The first lesson began immediately. Modern warriors, accustomed to standing behind energy shields and trading devastating blows, had grown lazy in their tactical thinking. They expected their enemies to fight like them, to stand and exchange fire until superior technology determined the winner. Elena came out of her role behind an ornate display case containing Andromedan crystal sculptures. The case provided minimal physical protection, but it served a more important purpose. It blocked the line of sight for half the guards, forcing them to reposition if they wanted a clear shot. "She's using the environment," muttered one of the hegemony soldiers, his voice carrying clearly through his helmet's external speakers. "Like some kind of primitive guerrilla fighter." "Exactly like a primitive guerrilla fighter," Elena called back, her voice echoing from behind the display case. "The kind that held off 50 advanced civilizations for 300 years. Captain Thrix gestured sharply to his men, directing them to surround her position. They moved with military precision, their heavy boots ringing against the polished floor. Their energy shields flared brighter as they prepared for sustained combat. But Elena was no longer behind the display case. While they had been focused on surrounding her last known position, she had moved again, using the crowd of panicking aliens as cover. The lesson was simple, but effective. When facing superior firepower, the key was never to be where your enemy expected you to be. "Over here, Captain," Elena called from the opposite side of the hall. Thrix spun around, his weapon seeking a target, but Elena had already moved again. She was now positioned behind another piece of cover, this time a massive Vortani art installation that reached nearly to the ceiling. "Stop playing games," Thrix roared, his frustration evident. "Face us directly." "Why would I do that?" Elena asked, genuinely curious. "You have better armor, better weapons, and superior numbers. Any human who fought fair under those circumstances would be dead." This drew nervous laughter from some of the alien observers. They were beginning to understand that they weren't witnessing a lopsided execution, but rather a master class in asymmetric warfare. Elena shifted position again, and this time several guards caught glimpses of her movement. They opened fire immediately, their plasma bolts turning the air into a deadly light show. But Elena had anticipated their reaction, and she was already moving to her next position before the first shot was fired. The hegemony weapons were devastating in their power. Where the plasma bolts struck, metal melted and stone cracked. The ornate decorations of the auction hall began to resemble a war zone as the guards tried desperately to pin down their elusive target. "She's making us destroy the building to get to her," observed one of the soldiers with grudging admiration. "More than that," replied his partner. "She's using our own firepower against us. We can't use our heavy weapons without risking civilian casualties." Elena had counted on exactly that limitation. The galaxy's advanced civilizations prided themselves on their precision and their restraint. They had rules of engagement, protocols to protect innocent bystanders, and sophisticated weapons designed to minimize collateral damage. But Elena's grandfather had fought during humanity's darkest hour, when such luxuries were unthinkable. He had learned to turn every limitation into an advantage, every weakness into a weapon. From her new position behind an overturned table, Elena finally raised the ancient rifle and took aim. The weapon felt solid and reliable in her hands, its simple mechanical systems requiring no power source beyond her own skill and determination. Captain Smirks saw her emerging from cover and immediately fired his plasma pistol. The energy bolt screamed across the hall with the power to melt through a starship's hull, its blue-white light painting everything in stark shadows. Elena squeezed the trigger. The rifle spoke with a voice like thunder, its chemical propellant detonating in a brief flash of flame and smoke. The sound was different from modern weapons, deeper and more primal, echoing through the hall like an earthquake. Smirks's plasma bolt seared past Elena's position, close enough that she could feel its heat through her clothing. But Elena's bullet, a simple piece of shaped metal traveling at tremendous velocity, struck the captain's energy shield dead center. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. The shield flared brightly as its generators struggled to deflect the incoming projectile. The technology was designed to disperse energy attacks across its entire surface, turning devastating plasma bolts into harmless light shows. But a kinetic projectile was different. All that energy had to go somewhere, and the shield generators weren't designed to handle a concentrated physical impact. The bullet punched through the energy barrier like it wasn't there, its momentum barely affected by the defensive field. Captain Smirks staggered backward, his eyes wide with shock. His armor had stopped the bullet, but the impact had been tremendous. He looked down at his chest plate, where a deep dent showed exactly where the primitive projectile had struck. "Impossible," he whispered. The hall fell silent, except for the ringing echoes of the rifle shot. Every alien present stared in disbelief at the scene before them. The most advanced personal defense system in the galaxy had been penetrated by a weapon that should have been obsolete centuries ago. Elena worked the rifle's bolt action, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a fresh round. The mechanical sounds seemed unnaturally loud in the stunned silence. "Energy shields deflect energy," she explained calmly, as if she were teaching a basic physics class. "They're designed to spread thermal attacks across their entire surface, but they were never meant to stop a concentrated kinetic impact." One of the hegemony guards raised his weapon nervously. "Captain, what are your orders?" Smirks was still staring at the dent in his armor, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The implications were staggering. If human kinetic weapons could penetrate modern shields, then every defensive system in the galaxy might be vulnerable. "The records," he said suddenly. "The war archives. They always mentioned that humans used primitive kinetic weapons, but we assumed that meant they were using inferior technology." "You assumed wrong," Elena replied, shifting her position again to maintain her tactical advantage. "My people didn't use kinetic weapons because they were primitive. They used them because they worked." A new voice cut through the tension. "Fascinating." Everyone turned to see Ambassador Korath of the Zephyrian Empire stepping forward, his compound eyes fixed on the rifle in Elena's hands. "We always wondered why the war took so long. 50 civilizations with overwhelming technological superiority facing one world with supposedly inferior weapons." Elena kept the rifle ready, but she could sense that the immediate threat had passed. The aliens were no longer seeing her as a target to be eliminated, but as a puzzle to be solved. "You want to know the truth about the human war?" Elena asked. Captain Thrix holstered his plasma pistol, his military training finally overcoming his shock. "Tell us." Elena lowered the rifle slightly, though she remained ready to raise it again at the first sign of aggression. Around the hall, the assembled aliens pressed closer, eager to hear secrets that had been buried with the human homeworld. "The truth is that humans never fought the kind of war you expected," Elena began. "You brought fleets of starships armed with planet-killing weapons, expecting us to meet you in open space with matching technology." "But you didn't," Ambassador Korath observed. "We couldn't," Elena admitted. "We had maybe a dozen ships that could challenge your fleet. So instead we fought the kind of war we understood. Every human world became a fortress. Every city became a maze of defensive positions. Every civilian became a soldier." She gestured with the rifle toward the damaged auction hall around them. "You've spent the last hour learning what our enemies learned over 3 centuries of warfare. Advanced technology means nothing if you can't bring it to bear effectively." Captain Thrix was beginning to understand. "Your people turned the entire war into a series of ground engagements. Urban warfare, tunnel fighting, guerrilla tactics." "Exactly," Elena confirmed. "And in that kind of fighting, energy shields are useless because they light up your position for every sniper in the area. Plasma weapons are impractical because they can't penetrate cover without massive collateral damage. And heavy armor just makes you a bigger target for kinetic weapons." The implications were staggering. The galactic records of the human war suddenly made sense in a completely different light. What had been recorded as humanity's primitive stubbornness was actually sophisticated strategic thinking. "But you lost," pointed out one of the Andromedan nobles. Elena's expression grew sad. "Yes, we lost. Eventually, your combined fleets decided that the only way to end the war was to destroy every human world completely. No ground invasions, no occupation forces. Just orbital bombardment until nothing remained." The hall fell silent as the assembled aliens contemplated the implications of her words. They had won the war not through superior tactics or better warriors, but through genocide on an unimaginable scale. 50 million lives per world, Elena continued quietly, and we made you pay for every single one. Captain Thrix removed his helmet, revealing scarred reptilian features and eyes that had seen too much combat. "My grandfather fought in that war. He used to tell stories about human positions that held out for months against impossible odds. We always thought he was exaggerating." "He wasn't," Elena assured him. The captain looked down at his dented armor, then back at the rifle in Elena's hands. "Show me," he said suddenly. The entire hall turned to stare at him in surprise. "Captain?" one of his guards asked uncertainly. "Show me how it works," Thrix repeated, his voice growing stronger. "I want to understand how one woman with an ancient weapon could outfight a dozen of my best soldiers." Elena studied his face for a moment, looking for signs of deception or trap, but she saw only genuine curiosity and professional respect. Slowly, she began to explain the principles that had made human warriors so effective. "First," she said, "you have to stop thinking like a modern soldier and start thinking like a hunter. Your enemy isn't just another warrior with comparable equipment. He's prey to be stalked, trapped, and eliminated with minimal risk to yourself." She demonstrated how human soldiers had used their environment, turning every piece of cover into a potential firing position and every shadow into concealment. She showed how they moved, always thinking 3 steps ahead, always planning their next position before abandoning their current one. "Second," Elena continued, "you have to understand that your weapon is just a tool. The real weapon is your mind. Everything else, the rifle, the ammunition, the cover, it's all just an extension of your tactical thinking. As she spoke, the assembled aliens began to understand why the human war had been such a traumatic experience for their ancestors. They weren't just fighting an enemy with different technology. They were fighting an enemy with a completely different philosophy of warfare. But Elena wasn't finished with her lesson. There was one more demonstration she needed to give. One final truth that the galaxy needed to understand about human weapons and the warriors who wielded them. She raised the rifle again, and this time, her target wasn't Captain Thrix or his guards. This time, she was aiming at something that would change everything the assembled aliens thought they knew about human military technology. The real lesson was about to begin. Elena raised the ancient rifle with deliberate precision, her target clear in her mind. The assembled aliens watched with growing tension as she aimed not at any person, but at a massive hegemony combat drone that hung suspended from the auction hall's ceiling as part of a military technology display. The drone was a masterpiece of modern warfare engineering. Its hull could withstand direct hits from cruiser-class weapons, its shields could deflect anything short of a planet-killer beam, and its weapon systems could level entire city blocks. It represented the pinnacle of galactic military technology, a symbol of the unstoppable power that had conquered human space. "That drone is worth more than this entire building," Captain Thrix said nervously. "Its armor is 20 centimeters of neutronium composite. Nothing short of a battleship weapon can penetrate that hull." Elena smiled grimly as she adjusted her aim. "My grandfather faced dozens of those during the siege of New Terra. They called them flying fortresses back then. The hegemony used them to patrol human cities, hunting resistance fighters like my grandfather's unit." Her finger found the trigger, but she didn't fire immediately. Instead, she continued her explanation, keeping the weapon trained on her target. "The problem with perfect armor," Elena said, "is that it makes engineers overconfident. They assume that if something can't be broken, it doesn't need to be protected in other ways." Ambassador Korith's compound eyes fixed on the rifle. "You cannot seriously believe that ancient weapon can damage modern military hardware." "Watch closely," Elena replied. She squeezed the trigger, and once again the rifle spoke with its deep, thunderous voice. The bullet streaked across the hall, a tiny piece of shaped metal carrying 3 centuries of human ingenuity and determination. The projectile struck the drone's hull dead center, and for a moment nothing seemed to happen. The neutronium armor held firm, the bullet failing to penetrate the incredibly dense material. Several aliens began to chuckle, assuming that Elena's demonstration had failed. But Elena wasn't finished. She worked the bolt action again, chambering another round. "Lesson 1, she announced, taking aim at a slightly different spot on the drone's hull. "Armor is only as strong as its weakest point." The second shot rang out, striking the drone just centimeters from the first impact point. Again, the armor held, but now there was a small network of stress fractures radiating outward from the impact sites. "Lesson 2, Elena continued, chambering a third round. "Persistence beats perfection." The third shot struck between the first 2 impacts. This time, a small section of armor actually cracked, though the drone remained structurally sound. Captain Thrix was beginning to understand. "You're not trying to penetrate the armor directly. You're creating a failure cascade." "Exactly," Elena confirmed, lining up her 4th shot. Human engineers understood something that galactic civilization forgot during its age of energy weapons. Sometimes the best way to defeat superior technology is to make it defeat itself. The 4th bullet struck the growing web of cracks with perfect precision. The damaged section of armor finally gave way, creating a small hole in the drone's supposedly impenetrable hull. But Elena wasn't aiming at the armor. She was aiming through the hole she had created, targeting the complex electronics housed within the drone's protective shell. The 5th shot screamed through the breach and struck the drone's main power coupling, Sparks erupted from the hole as the combat machine's systems began failing in sequence. Warning lights flickered across its surface as backup systems tried desperately to compensate for the cascade failure. The entire drone shuddered, its repulsors struggling to maintain altitude. With a grinding sound of metal and failing electronics, the massive war machine crashed to the floor of the auction hall, sending debris flying in all directions. The hall erupted in chaos as the assembled aliens stared in shock at the destroyed military hardware. The drone had been worth more than some planetary defense budgets, and it had been brought down by 5 bullets from a weapon that most of them considered a museum piece. "Impossible," whispered one of the Vortani delegates. "That drone was designed to withstand concentrated fire from an entire fleet." Elena lowered the rifle, smoke still curling from its barrel. "It was designed to withstand energy weapons," she corrected. "Concentrated thermal attacks that would strike its armor and be dispersed across the entire hull. But kinetic weapons work differently." She gestured toward the fallen drone, where small fires were still burning in its exposed electronics. Each bullet delivered its entire kinetic energy to a single point. No dispersion, no spreading the impact across a wider area. Just concentrated force applied with surgical precision. Captain Thrix approached the wreckage, his expression thoughtful. The stress fractures propagated through the armor's crystal matrix. Multiple impacts in the same area created a resonance effect that amplified the damage. "My grandfather called it cracking the shell," Elena explained. "Find the weak point, keep hitting it until it breaks. Then exploit the breach to strike at the vulnerable systems inside." Ambassador Korith was examining the rifle with new respect. "The weapon appears crude, but the tactical application is sophisticated. Your people understood materials, science principles that we ignored because our technology seemed superior." Elena nodded. "Humans never had the luxury of technological superiority. We had to fight smarter, not harder. Every weapon we built, every tactic we developed, was designed to exploit the weaknesses of superior enemies." One of the Andromedan nobles stepped forward, his expression troubled. "If your people understood these principles, why did you ultimately lose the war?" Elena's expression grew sad as she considered the question. "Because in the end, tactics and superior weapons can only take you so far against overwhelming numbers. The galaxy brought 50 civilizations against one world. We killed millions of your soldiers, destroyed thousands of your ships, and held out for 3 centuries. But eventually, even the best warriors run out of ammunition." She looked around the assembled crowd, seeing the dawning understanding in their alien features. They were beginning to comprehend not just how human weapons worked, but why the war had been such a traumatic experience for their ancestors. "The final battle records," Captain Thrix said slowly. "The ones that were classified for centuries. They mentioned that human positions continued fighting even after orbital bombardment began. We always assumed those reports were exaggerated." "They weren't," Elena confirmed. "My grandfather was at the last stronghold on Terra Prime. They fought for 6 months while the planet burned around them. Every bunker, every tunnel, every basement became a fortress. The hegemony had to glass the entire continent to finally silence the last human weapon." She raised the rifle slightly, its worn wooden stock catching the auction hall's lights. "This weapon survived because my grandfather gave it to a refugee transport just before the final assault. It's been waiting 3 centuries for someone to remember what it represents." The hall fell silent as the implications of her words sank in. The assembled aliens were looking at more than just an ancient weapon. They were looking at a symbol of the most determined resistance their civilization had ever faced. "What happens now?" asked Ambassador Korith. Elena considered the question carefully. Around her, she could see the aliens looking at her with a mixture of respect, fear, and curiosity. They had come to mock a relic of a dead civilization, but they had learned that some things transcend technology and time. "Now," Elena said. You remember. You remember that humans weren't primitive savages who threw rocks at starships. We were warriors who understood that victory doesn't always go to the most advanced technology. She slung the rifle across her shoulder, the movement practiced and natural. You remember that courage and determination and tactical thinking can overcome any advantage. And most importantly, you remember that the human spirit didn't die when Earth burned. Captain Thrix removed his sidearm and laid it carefully on the floor. A gesture of respect that was quickly copied by his guards. We will remember, he promised. Elena nodded her thanks, then turned to address the entire assembly. The auction is over, she announced. This weapon is going home. As she walked toward the hall's exit, the assembled aliens parted before her like water. Some bowed their heads in respect. Others simply stared in amazement at what they had witnessed. The human was leaving, but the lessons she had taught would stay with them forever. Behind her, the wreckage of the combat drone continued to smolder, a testament to the power of human ingenuity and the enduring legacy of warriors who refused to surrender even when facing impossible odds. Ambassador Korith watched her go, his compound eyes reflecting the auction hall's lights. Perhaps, he said quietly, we should reconsider our understanding of what makes a species truly dangerous. Elena paused at the threshold of the hall, looking back one final time at the aliens who had gathered to mock her people's memory. Captain Thrix, she called. The hegemony officer stepped forward. Yes? Your grandfather was right, Elena told him. The stories he told weren't exaggerations. If anything, they didn't capture the full truth of what human warriors could accomplish when they refused to give up. She hefted the rifle slightly, feeling its familiar weight. But remember this as well. We never wanted to be warriors. We became warriors because you left us no choice. Perhaps it's time for the galaxy to learn a different lesson. And what lesson is that? Thrix asked. Elena smiled, and for the first time since entering the auction hall, it was a genuinely warm expression. That the greatest victory is the war that never has to be fought. With that, she walked out of the auction hall and into the bustling streets of the space station beyond. The rifle went with her, carrying its burden of history and hope toward whatever future awaited the last children of Earth. Behind her, in the damaged auction hall, a group of aliens began the long process of reevaluating everything they thought they knew about courage, determination, and the true meaning of advanced civilization. The human war had ended 3 centuries ago, but the most important lesson was just beginning. Sometimes the most primitive weapon is the one wielded by an unconquerable spirit, and sometimes the most advanced technology is wisdom earned through sacrifice and tempered by the refusal to surrender. Marcus Chen would have been proud of his granddaughter. The ghost of Terra Prime lived on, and the galaxy would never forget what one human with an ancient rifle could teach them about the true nature of strength.